An interesting character called Melchizedek. We've already seen referenced in chapter 2 and in chapter 5, where the writer said, I would like to go on and explain more about this comparison of Melchizedek and Aaron's priesthood, but you're dull of hearing. Now he comes back in chapter 7 and he builds further his case. Let's talk about that today in the Word. Good morning and welcome back to Today in the Word. Hi, I'm Glenn Schaefer, and I want to welcome all of you who are listening to our podcast, and thank you if you're here on the YouTube, and if you have not subscribed, could I ask you to do so and help us get the word out, plus you'll be notified each time these teachings come out. As you know, we're in Hebrews chapter 7 today, and we're going to work our way down through verse 10. And the significance of this chapter to these believers who had a Jewish background is very, very important. Today he introduces Melchizedek, this priesthood that he wanted to talk to them about in Hebrews chapter 5, but because of the dullness of their hearing, he said, we got to move on to other things. But he wanted to be able to explain the significance of this. And here he begins in chapter 7. We're not only reminded in chapter 2 that we have a high priest, and in chapter 5 the need for it. In chapter 6 he wraps it up by saying this Jesus that we have, who's the anchor of our soul, that's tied into the presence of God right behind the veil. He says, even Jesus, who is the high priest of the order of Melchizedek. So now he moves from that right into chapter 7. Let's read the first 3 verses. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being translated King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, meaning King of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now, the writer of Hebrews, God is giving him, obviously, wisdom, because this is God's word, as he would reach back to their patriarch Abraham and to show how important Jesus is, that even Abraham would have paid tithe to Melchizedek. They would have known the story of Melchizedek. It's a short story out of Genesis 14, like verse 18 through 20, just a little short story for us. And here he references it as authority of Christ. It says, who met Abraham, talking about Melchizedek, from returning from the slaughter of the kings. There was a confederacy of kings that came together in war and captured Abraham's brother Lot. He took his 318 fighting men who were specially trained, and they went, and here in Hebrews it called it a slaughter of the kings. Wow. And he brought back Lot. When he did, he was met by 2 kings, one the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. 2 contrasting different kings. Sodom, part of the twin city of Sodom and Gomorrah, right there by the river of Jordan and by the Dead Sea, which would receive God's judgments later. And Lot would have to be delivered again by the intercession of Abraham. But here he goes and he receives his brother back. He's met by the king of Sodom, who's going to try to negotiate something, thinking that Abraham is going to flaunt his authority like kings did and humiliate all those whom he's captured. So he's going to try to negotiate. But the king of Salem, which means the king of peace, he was a high priest, and he came. Now it's unusual for these Hebrews to hear that you could be a high priest and a king. Now they would know about Melchizedek, but the Levitical priesthood and the order of the law changed that. So you could not be king and priest. Now Christ is of this order of Melchizedek, who is both our king and priest. We are a royal priesthood together. We have a high priest and a king. And so he's appealing to these Christians to say, wait a minute, you've got to remember your patriarch Abraham understood this. And when he met the king of Salem, he called him a priest of the Most High God. So he was not only a worshiper of God, he was a high priest. He was a priest of the Most High God. So he's showing the greatness of God is magnified by Melchizedek's priesthood itself. Now, when these two kings met up with Abraham, the king of Sodom was wanting to negotiate with him and saying, hey, you keep all the stuff and let me have the people back. And Abraham was only interested in giving to God through Melchizedek an honor and a worship for God's provision. And except for the needs of his fighting men taken care of, he was willing to give it all back to the king of Sodom, which shows us that when we tithe, we are tithing out of what God owns. He doesn't just own the tithe, he owns it all. But the king of Sodom had one main, but now the king of Salem came with a whole different mindset to bless. He came to bless him. Why? Because a high priest can only bless, right? So he came to bless him, and he was the king of righteousness and the king of peace. It's interesting he mentions in that order because for us as believers, there is no peace without righteousness. So he's called the king of righteousness, and then the king of Salem, which means the king of peace. It's defined as that. Actually became later known as Jerusalem, which was the city of peace, or the foundation. The word actually means Jerusalem, the foundation of peace. So we have the order of righteousness, the order of peace. Now he says he was without father and without mother, no beginning of days, nor the end of life. Now what it's saying here, there's no biblical genealogy of Melchizedek. Now this is where some of the commentaries disagree, and some believe this was a Christophany of Christ, meaning a pre-incarnate form of Christ, which you would see like in Genesis 18 when there's two angels and God himself came and met with Abraham. And in Genesis 12, you'll see another reference where the Lord appeared to Abraham. And so those would be seen as Christophany, meaning God himself in the pre-incarnate place of Christ. Here, some people believe that's who Melchizedek was because it mentions he has no genealogy. The problem with that, now others might say he's angelic or he's superhuman form or whatever. The problem with that is that in order to be a high priest, as the writer of Hebrews points out to them, and they would well know as Jews and as Hebrews, that you could not be a high priest unless you were human. An angel cannot be a high priest for human because you're going on behalf of one of like yourself. That's why this couldn't be Christ as far as I can see, because Christ had to become human before he could be a high priest. He was made to be our high priest. He wasn't our high priest. He was made to be our high priest. Through the things he came to this earth and suffered, he was exalted and made our high priest. So this could not be a non-human. So evidently the emphasis is being made to these Hebrews. You're held up on the Levitical, because God set it in order. For the Levitical priesthood to happen, there had to be a genealogy. It had to know who the mother and father was. There had to be a line trace. It came from the tribe of Levi, and it came from the sons of Aaron to be a high priest. Here we have Melchizedek that has no record of father and mother. So he's of a different order. He's made like the Son of God. It isn't that Jesus has the Melchizedek kind of priesthood. It's Melchizedek has Jesus's kind of priesthood. Christ is not made like Melchizedek, but the other way around. Made like means similar, or it's familiar to. It's like a preview of Christ, and he remains a priest continually. Now, to emphasize this, the writer of Hebrews jumps in and uses this analogy of the tithe that was paid. Let's look at verse 4 down through verse 10. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law. That is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithe from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Now he's using this analogy of tithe because they would have known that God made an ordained recipient to receive the tithe. He said even under the Levitical order, it's under commandment that you pay tithe. Now Abraham gave it voluntarily, but he says you're under commandment to pay tithe. Now, interesting along this subject, we still tithe today, though we're not under commandment in that same sense of the Levitical order to do that which would be accepted, but we do it out of worship like Abraham did. Abraham did it voluntarily and honoring that God is the possessor of all things and that no one, even Sodom, would not make him rich, but he honored God. Not only the tithe belonged to God, but all of his possessions belonged to God, and that was a recognition of it. He was honoring him for who he was. Now, Paul makes this connection for us because Christ in the New Testament is our high priest, and we're all of the same level of royal priesthood. There's no priest among us in that sense because Christ is our high priest. Yet, Paul makes the analogy for the tithe that God has an ordained recipient even in the New Testament. Did you know that? Let me just point this out because in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 13 through 14, Paul says, don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple? Meaning that's what the Levitical priesthood was about. And those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar. So that's how the Old Testament Levitical priests that Hebrews is talking about, how they receive tithe. In the New Testament, however, while I'm on the subject, Paul makes the leap for us, ties the Old Covenant together with the New Covenant, meaning that this tithing was before the law. That's why this is pointed out in Hebrews, for them to see the validity of Melchizedek or the validity of Christ's priesthood because it was of a different order than the law. Well, Paul kind of does something similar for us here on tithing. In verse 14, he says, in the same way, the Lord has commanded. This is a commandment, that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Now it's interesting how he makes that statement, but he ties it to the tithing principle of the Levitical order. Since we don't have any priests, he says, then those who labor in the gospel should receive their living from that. Now going back to this idea that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham because Abraham paid tithe to him, because they would have known that the lesser blesses the greater, or the better, as it says here in this translation. That Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. He gave it voluntarily. The spoils meaning right off the top. He took it right off the top. He says, even Levi, who receives tithe, paid tithe through Abraham, so to speak. And when he mentions so to speak, he's talking allegorically, he's talking metaphorically here, that he's saying this would have happened because they would have been in Abraham's loins. There was a recognition, which is powerful, of the covenant itself that Abraham was honoring Melchizedek, saying even the Levitical priesthood who you trust in actually honored Melchizedek through their father Abraham. So should you see the order of the high priest of Christ, who's after that order. So you see the argument that's being made here for the Hebrews is to see that God was already at work before the law. God was already at work before Moses. God was already at work before the Levitical priesthood. Now we have a priesthood of Christ who's of the order of Melchizedek, which was already set in order that their father Abraham paid tithe to. So you've got to see this is the order of God, Christ himself as the high priest. Man, I trust that's blessing you as we walk through these times of teaching today in the Word.